London, 1888. Whitechapel drowns in fog so thick it swallows screams whole. In these stinking alleys, something inhuman begins to hunt. He moves like smoke, silent, surgical, gone before the blood cools. He carves women with a blade that knows anatomy too well, sends letters written in red ink and half a human kidney, then vanishes. The world gave him a name that still freezes the blood, Jack the Ripper. For 138 years we've chased him. Books, films, even 2025 DNA that almost named a mad barber. Headlines screamed, case closed. Scotland Yard still says, open, because on certain foggy nights, you can still feel him. The cold breath on your neck, the footstep that stops when yours stops. The phantom never left. He simply learned to wait. Welcome again to my channel. This is Shadow. Today's story is chilling and creepy, so you better take your sit and grab a drink and let us dive into the journey. London, 1888. Not the glittering London of the Queen's Jubilee or the crystal palaces of the rich. This was the other London, the East End, the abscess at the heart of the empire. Whitechapel, Spitalfields, Brick Lane, a warren of narrow courts and blind alleys where 80,000 souls were packed like rats in a sewer. The air itself was a living thing, yellow with coal smoke and factory soot, heavy with the reek of boiling tripe, sour beer, and the open sewers that ran like veins beneath the cobblestones. Children with rickets played in gutters thick with horse dung. Women sold themselves for fourpence, the price of a crust of bread and a bed for the night. Men drank themselves blind in gin palaces that never closed. And above it all, the fog. Oh, the fog. It rolled in off the Thames like the breath of something ancient and hungry, swallowing gas lamps whole, turning every street corner into a hiding place. In that fog a man could strike with deadly intent 10 feet from a policeman and simply vanish, as though the night itself had opened its mouth and swallowed him. No one noticed when he first arrived. Perhaps he had always been there. Perhaps he stepped off a ship from Poland or Russia or the Americas and simply walked into the darkness and never walked out again. The women of Whitechapel would later swear they felt his eyes on them weeks before the first scream. A shadow that lingered too long in doorways. A soft footstep that stopped when theirs stopped. A presence that made the hairs on their necks rise even when the gin had dulled every other sense. They called the district the Abyss. They had no idea how deep it was about to become. Her name was Marian Nichols, but everyone knew her as Polly. 43 years old, once married to a printer, mother of 5 children she had lost to the workhouse or to death. The drink had taken the rest. By the summer of 1888 she was sleeping in common lodging houses on Thrall Street, earning her DOS money the only way left to her, on her back in the dark. On the night of Thursday, the 30th of August, she was turned out of her lodging at 1:40 a.m. because she had no money. The deputy keeper remembered her laughing as she stepped into the street. "I'll soon get my DOS money," she said. "I've had my lucky bonnet on all day." That was the last anyone heard her voice while she still had a throat. At 3:15 a.m., Charles Cross, a carman on his way to work, walked along Bucks Row, a short, quiet street of warehouses and stables behind the Whitechapel Road. The fog was thick enough to taste. His lantern barely cut 3 yards. Then he saw something lying against the gateway of a stable. At first he thought it was a tarpaulin dropped by a carter. He prodded it with his boot. It was Polly Nichols. She was found lying in the shadows of Whitechapel, her body marked by violence. The scene carried an eerie precision, as though the attacker had known exactly what they were doing. There was little trace left behind, only the unsettling impression of a calculated hand. The silence of the street was heavy, and the horror lay not in what was seen, but in what was implied, the terrifying skill of someone who moved like a phantom through the fog. Cross ran for help. Police Constable John Neal arrived minutes later. He shone his lamp on the face. Polly's eyes were wide open, staring into the fog as though she had seen her killer's face in the last second and could not believe what she saw. By dawn, Inspector Frederick Aberline was there, the quiet, methodical detective who would spend the next 3 months chasing a ghost. He stared at the body and felt something he had never felt before in 20 years on the force. Not disgust, not pity, a cold, crawling certainty that this was only the beginning. The newspapers barely noticed. One small paragraph in the morning editions. Another East End whore dead. Nothing new. 8 days later they would never make that mistake again. The second one was Annie Chapman, 4 to 7, once a respectable coachman's wife. Now a widow who drank to forget her dead children and the cancer eating her insides. She lived at 35 Dorset Street, the worst lodging house in the worst street in London, the worst street in the world. The papers would soon call it. On the night of the 7th of September, she was turned away from her bed for lack of money, just like Polly. She told the other women in the kitchen she would soon be back with the fourpence. "I'll soon get it," she said. "I've got a friend round the corner who'll see me right." At 5:30 a.m. on the 8th of September, John Davis, a porter who lived at 29 Hanbury Street, stepped into the narrow backyard to use the privy. The fog still clung to the ground like a shroud. He saw her immediately. Annie Chapman was discovered in the yard between the steps and the fence. The violence she suffered was shocking, carried out with chilling precision. What unsettled investigators most was not only the brutality, but the silence. Neighbors slept just feet away, separated only by a flimsy fence, yet no one heard a cry or a struggle. It was as if the killer moved invisibly, leaving behind only the eerie impression of deliberate skill. A witness, Mrs. Elizabeth Long, had seen Annie talking to a man at 5:25 a.m. just outside the house. The man was dark-haired, wore a deerstalker hat and a dark coat. He was about 40. His voice was soft, almost gentlemanly. "Will you?" he asked her. Annie had answered, "Yes." Then they had walked together into the passage that led to the yard. That was the last time anyone saw Annie Chapman alive. The panic that had been a whisper after Polly Nichols now became a scream. Women refused to go out after dark. Men formed vigilante committees and patrolled the streets with lanterns and sticks. The newspapers, the Star, the Illustrated Police News, the Pall Mall Gazette, began to print the most lurid illustrations they could draw. Headlines screamed, "Another horrible murder in Whitechapel, and is there a maniac at large?" Scotland Yard was flooded with letters. Some offered help. Some confessed. Some accused their neighbors. Some were simply mad. And still the killer walked free. Aberline and his men worked day and night. They questioned every butcher, every slaughterman, every doctor, every foreigner in the district. They examined every knife. They traced every rumor. Nothing. The man left no footprints that led anywhere. No blood trail. No discarded weapon. He killed, he mutilated, he took what he wanted, and he melted back into the fog as though he had never existed. By now the women of Whitechapel had given him a name in whispers. They no longer called him the murderer. They called him Leather Apron, because some early witnesses claimed the man they saw wore a leather apron like a butcher. The name spread like fever. Mothers threatened naughty children with him. Prostitutes crossed themselves when they spoke it. But the real name, the name that would echo down 138 years of nightmares, had not yet been written in red ink. That would come on the night of the 30th of September. The night he killed twice. The night he proved to the world that no lock, no policeman, no vigilante could stop him. The fog that night was the thickest anyone could remember. It pressed against the windows like something alive, trying to get in. The gas lamps burned with a sickly yellow halo. The streets were almost empty. Even the drunks stayed indoors. At 12:45 a.m. Louis Deemschutz, a salesman returning to his club in Dutfield's Yard, Berner Street, drove his pony cart into the narrow passage. The pony shied. Deemschutz jumped down and struck a match. There, in the darkness against the wall, lay Elizabeth Stride, 45 years old, Swedish, separated from her husband. A quiet, hard-working woman who sometimes cleaned rooms and sometimes walked the streets. She was found with a single, devastating wound to her neck. Unlike other victims, her body showed no further signs of mutilation. Something, or someone, had interrupted the killer before he could begin his work. A cart rattling into the yard at the exact wrong moment. The pony's hooves. A shout. The killer had fled into the fog again, leaving his work unfinished. Less than an hour later, less than half a mile away, he finished it. Catherine Eddowes, 46, known as Kate. A cheerful, hard-drinking woman who had just been released from Bishopsgate Police Station at 1 a.m. after being locked up for drunkenness. She told the constable who released her, "I'll get a damn fine hiding when I get home." She never made it home. At 1:45 a.m. PC Edward Watkins walked his beat through Mitre Square, a small, open court surrounded by warehouses. The fog was so thick he could barely see the opposite wall. He swung his lantern. What he saw made him retch. Catherine Eddowes was found in the corner of the square. The violence she suffered was extreme, carried out with disturbing precision. What shocked investigators most was how quickly it had all happened. Policemen passed through the area every 15 minutes, yet the killer managed to work in complete silence between their rounds. The scene left the impression of someone who moved with terrifying skill and calculation. And then, as if to mock them, he left a clue. In Goulston Street, a few hundred yards away, a bloody piece of Catherine's apron was found. Above it, written in chalk on the black wall, were the words, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Commissioner Sir Charles Warren arrived at 5 a.m. He took one look at the message and ordered it erased immediately. He feared anti-Jewish riots. The only clue the killer had ever left was wiped away before the sun rose. The double event. 2 women in one night. The newspapers went insane. And then the letters began. On the 27th of September, the Central News Agency received a letter written in red ink. It boasted of the murders. It promised more. It was signed, for the first time, Jack the Ripper. The name stuck like blood on a blade. It has never come off. The fog thickened. The women screamed. The police hunted. And somewhere in the darkness of Whitechapel, the man who now had a name smiled in the shadows and prepared for his masterpiece. The night of the 9th of November. The fog that November night was not merely weather. It was a living veil, thick as wool soaked in Thames water, pressing its cold, wet fingers against every pane of glass in Whitechapel. Gas lamps struggled like drowning men, their yellow halos swallowed whole. The streets were empty by 10 o'clock. Even the gin-soaked bravado of the Doss House men had failed. They knew. Everyone knew. The shadow with the knife had already claimed 5 souls, and the calendar was turning toward the 9th. Mary Jane Kelly was 25 years old, or so she claimed. Some said 27. No one knew for certain. The East End swallowed birthdays along with everything else. She was Irish by birth, beautiful in a way that still showed through the bruises and the drink, long dark hair, blue eyes that could laugh even when her belly was empty. She had once lived in France, she told people, singing in a high-class house. She had been married, briefly, to a collier who died in a pit explosion. The story changed with every glass of gin, but the sadness in it never did. By the autumn of 1888, she rented the tiny single room at 13 Miller's Court, off Dorset Street. It was barely 10 feet by 12, a cramped box with one window, one door, a rickety bed, a fireplace, and a table. The landlord, John McCarthy, called it the room. The women of the court called it the last safe place Mary Jane still had. Rent was 6 shillings a week. She was behind again. On the evening of the 8th of November, she was seen laughing with a friend, Lizzie Albrook, in the court. "Whatever happens," Mary Jane said, "I'll never go back to the streets. I'll die first." The words would echo like prophecy. At midnight, she was still drinking in the 10 Bells pub on Commercial Street, arm in arm with a man no one would ever describe clearly. Tall, perhaps, dark coat, soft voice. They left together into the fog. The last confirmed sighting came around 1:45 a.m. on the 9th of November. George Hutchinson, a labourer who knew Mary Jane well, passed her in Flower and Dean Street. She was with a man. Hutchinson would later give the most detailed description anyone ever offered of a possible ripper. Tall, well-dressed, gold watch chain, black felt hat, astrakhan-trimmed coat, dark complexion, Jewish-looking, about 35. The man carried a small parcel. Mary Jane was laughing. "You will be all right," the stranger told her. They walked toward Miller's Court. Hutchinson watched them until the fog closed around them like a curtain. Then silence. The night passed. The fog thickened until dawn could not break it. At 10:45 a.m. on the 9th of November, Thomas Bowyer, MacArthur's assistant, came to collect the overdue rent. He knocked at the door of number 13. No answer. He tried the handle. Lucked. He peered through the broken window pane, the one Mary Jane had smashed days earlier to let in air, and lifted the curtain with a stick. What he saw would haunt him until the day he died. Mary Jane Kelly was found in her room at Miller's Court. What investigators discovered was unlike anything they had seen before, violence carried out with both fury and chilling patience. The scene was so extreme that every previous crime seemed almost restrained by comparison. The killer had worked for hours, using the fire for light, leaving behind a room that spoke of deliberate cruelty and terrifying skill. It was the most disturbing of all the Whitechapel murders. He had been alone with her in that tiny room from roughly 2 a.m. until at least 6 a.m. No one in the court had heard a single scream. The only sound anyone remembered was a faint cry of, "Oh, murder," around 4 a.m., but such cries were common in Dorset Street. No one had stirred. Bowyer staggered back, vomited in the court, and ran for the police. When Inspector Eberline arrived, he stood in the doorway and for the first time in his career could not speak. The photographer's magnesium flash lit the room like lightning, freezing the horror forever. The images taken that day, the only crime scene photographs ever made of a canonical Ripper victim, would be locked away for decades. Even hardened officers wept. Dr. Thomas Bond, the police surgeon, performed the autopsy later that day and wrote words that still chill. The murderer must have had considerable knowledge of anatomy and surgical skill. The injuries were carried out with precision, in a deliberate and unhurried manner. One detail stood out. The victim's heart was missing and was never recovered. For the first time, the killer had not needed the cover of an alley. He had privacy. He had time. And he used every second of it to create a tableau that looked less like murder and more like a ritual sacrifice. The news spread faster than the fog could lift. By noon, the streets outside Miller's Court were jammed with thousands of people, women sobbing, men swearing vengeance, children trying to peer through the police cordon. Reporters fought each other for scraps of description. The Illustrated Police News printed a full-page engraving of the room that made strong men faint. Headlines screamed, "The most horrible murder of all and Jack T. Ripper's masterpiece." And still the letters kept coming. The most infamous, the one that would define the killer's voice forever, had actually arrived weeks earlier, on the 16th of October, addressed to George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Inside a small cardboard box, half a human kidney, preserved in spirits. The letter, written in crude red ink, read, "And because YouTube won't allow the language used, I'll write it down for you, my friend." The kidney was examined by Dr. Openshaw at the London hospital. It was human. It matched the missing portion from Catherine Eddowes. The handwriting was different from the earlier Dear Boss letters, but the taunting tone was the same. The public now believed the killer was not only mad, he was theatrical. He was enjoying the game. After Mary Kelly, more letters arrived, some claiming to be from him, some confessing, some offering clues. One even arrived at the police station with a piece of blood-stained cloth and the words, "I am still at work." Scotland Yard could no longer tell truth from hoax. The Ripper had become a phantom with 1,000 voices. The investigation collapsed under its own weight. Abberline chased every lead, foreign sailors, Jewish slaughtermen, mad doctors, even a royal carriage rumored to have been seen in the area. He interviewed hundreds. He examined every butcher's knife in Whitechapel. He brought in bloodhounds that promptly got lost in the fog. Nothing. The women of Miller's Court formed their own silent pact. They would not speak the name Jack the Ripper aloud after dark. Instead, they left small offerings of flowers and candles outside number 13. The room itself was sealed. McCarthy boarded up the window and the door. But the stench lingered for weeks. And then, silence. The gas lamps in Whitechapel guttered low after the horror of the 9th of November, 1888. The fog did not lift. It simply changed its shape. It crept now into the corridors of Scotland Yard itself, into the locked cabinets where the files grew thicker by the week and the silence grew heavier. Inspector Frederick Abberline worked until his eyes burned. He walked the alleys at the same hours the killer had struck. He questioned every barber, every surgeon, every foreigner who had ever muttered a threat. He stared at the chalked message that had been erased in Goulston Street until he could see the words in his sleep. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." But the phantom had vanished as cleanly as the fog at dawn. No more bodies. No more letters that rang with the same mad certainty. The women of Dorset Street still left flowers at the boarded-up door of 13 Miller's Court, but the screams had stopped. And yet the terror remained, deeper now, because it had no face to hate. In the years that followed, the secret files began to whisper names. The most damning document would not surface until long after the last witness was dust. It was written in the neat, careful hand of Sir Melville Macnaghten, Assistant Chief Constable, in 1894, 6 years after the killings ceased. A private memorandum, never meant for the public. In it, Macnaghten named 3 men he believed were the strongest suspects. 3 shadows who had walked the same streets as the victims. 3 men whose lives had brushed against the edge of madness at exactly the right, or wrong, moment. The first name on that list was Aaron Kosminski. He was 23 in 1888, a Polish-Jewish barber who had fled the pogroms and ended up in the heart of Whitechapel. Small, slight, with dark haunted eyes and a habit of muttering to himself. His own family said he was insane. He heard voices. He refused to eat food prepared by others. He carried a long-bladed knife for protection. Neighbors remembered him loitering near the alleys where the murders happened. He hated women, especially the ones who walked the streets at night. In 1891, his family had him committed to Coney Hatch Lunatic Asylum. He died there in 1919, still raving. McNaughton wrote of him coldly. Kosminski was a Polish Jew, and in the opinion of the police, the murderer. Later memos from Chief Inspector Donald Swanson would add even darker notes. Semen stains on the shawl found with Catherine Eddowes matched the suspect's profile. The police had watched him. They had almost taken him. But the evidence was never enough for a court. And so the little barber with the mad eyes slipped back into the fog of history. The second name chilled the blood in a different way. Montague John Drute. A gentleman. A barrister. A teacher at a good boys' school in Blackheath. Tall, handsome, athletic. He played cricket for the local club and rode on the Thames. From a respected family with money and connections. But something had cracked inside him. He was sacked from his teaching post in the summer of 1888 for grave misconduct, the exact nature never recorded. His mother had died in an asylum. His own brother would later tell police that Montague had always been strange. On the 31st of December, 1888, less than 2 months after Mary Jane Kelly's slaughter, Drute's body was pulled from the Thames near Chiswick. Stones in his pockets. A suicide note that spoke of unbearable guilt. McNaughton would later write that Drute's death coincided with the end of the murders, and that he was sexually insane. The timing was perfect. Too perfect. Some whispered he had been seen near Whitechapel. Others said a wealthy family had paid to hush up the truth. The gentleman with the cricket bat and the razor in his pocket. Had he simply walked into the river to escape the thing he had become? The third suspect was never named in full. McNaughton called him only Dr. D. A surgeon of some standing who had lost his mind and been locked away. Rumors swirled for decades that he was the royal physician or a doctor with royal connections. The fog loved those stories. They sold newspapers. They kept the terror alive. Abberline himself never believed any of them fully. In his private notes he wrote that the killer was a man of middle age, quiet and inoffensive in appearance, but with a terrible secret. He died in 1929 still wondering. The files gathered dust. The case was never closed. It was simply allowed to fade, like a nightmare you pretend you have forgotten. But the phantom does not fade. He waits. For more than a century, he waited in the shadows of books and films and Ripper walks. Whitechapel became a tourist trap where people paid to stand in the same alleys and feel the same cold breath on their necks. Theories multiplied like rats. The Duke of Clarence, a mad artist named Walter Sickert, an American quack doctor, even a woman, Jill the Ripper. Every new book promised the answer. Every one ended in the same place, the fog. Then, in 2007, something changed. A small silk shawl went up for auction in London. It was described as blood-stained and linked, by family legend, to Catherine Eddowes. Found beside her body in Mitre Square. Passed down through a policeman's family. The colors were still vivid, blue and orange, with a floral pattern and a long fringe. It had been in private hands for 119 years. A man named Russell Edwards bought it for £200. He was no detective. He was a tour guide, a ripperologist, a man obsessed. He believed the shawl was the key. He took it to Dr. Jori Luhalainen, a forensic scientist at Liverpool John Moores University. They extracted DNA from the stains. Blood that matched a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes. Semen that, they claimed, matched a descendant of Aaron Kosminski. In 2014, Edwards published a book, naming Jack the Ripper. He declared the case solved. The little Polish barber was the phantom. The world barely noticed. The scientific community scoffed. Mitochondrial DNA only. No full profile. Chain of custody broken over a century. Contamination possible. The shawl had been washed, handled, stored in attics. The claims were called suggestive at best. But Edwards never stopped. He kept the shawl. He kept testing. He waited for better science. And then, in February 2025, the fog lifted just enough for one blinding moment. New genetic analysis, peer-reviewed, more precise, was released. Edwards stood in front of cameras and held up the shawl again. "Without a doubt," he said, voice shaking, 100% it's him. The mitochondrial DNA from the semen stains matched Kosminski's maternal line exactly. The blood was Eddowes. The match was described as the strongest physical evidence ever found. Headlines exploded across the world. Jack the Ripper identified after 137 years. Descendants of the victims demanded a new inquest. Some called it justice at last. Kosminski, the mad barber who had died in an asylum in 1919, was finally named. But the phantom, it seems, does not surrender so easily. Even as the champagne corks popped in 2025, the scientists began to argue. Mitochondrial DNA proves only the maternal line. It cannot identify an individual with certainty. The shawl's provenance was still questionable. A 2024 expression of concern had already been issued in the Journal of Forensic Sciences about earlier work. Critics pointed out the same nomenclature errors that had haunted the 2014 claims. Contamination over 130 years was statistically likely. The match was suggestive, they said. Compelling, but not courtroom proof. McNaughton's old memo was dragged out again. Droot's suicide, the unnamed doctor, the royal conspiracy theories. The fog rolled back in thicker than ever. As of this very night in 2026, Scotland Yard has made no official statement. The case remains open in the records, unsolved. The inquest demanded by the victims' descendants has not been granted. The little room in Miller's Court is still boarded up in the minds of those who walk the tours. And somewhere in the yellow gaslight of Whitechapel, or in the quiet streets of a modern city where no one remembers the old names, the man who once called himself Jack the Ripper may still be laughing. Or perhaps he died in an asylum in 1919, his secret locked behind mad eyes. Or perhaps he walked into the Thames on a winter night and let the water take him. Or perhaps, and this is the thought that keeps the nightmare alive, he never stopped at all. He simply learned to wear different faces, different names, different centuries. The phantom never needed the fog to hide. He only needed us to keep looking the wrong way. McNaughton knew it. Abeline knew it. Edwards knows it now, even as he holds the shawl and swears the case is closed. The gas lamps still flicker. The alleys are still narrow. The morning after Mary Jane Kelly was found in that tiny slaughterhouse at 13 Miller's Court, the fog did something it had never done before. It lifted. Not completely, never completely in Whitechapel, but enough for the pale November sun to bleed through the yellow haze like a wound that refused to close. The streets were quieter than they had been in months. Women still walked with their heads down, but the screaming had stopped. The newspapers printed their last screaming headlines, then moved on to other horrors. Inspector Abeline sat in his office at Scotland Yard and stared at the growing pile of files until his eyes burned. And then, nothing. No more bodies carved with surgical fury. No more taunting letters that made the blood run cold. No more shadows slipping between gas lamps with a knife still wet. The phantom had simply vanished, as though the night itself had opened its jaws, swallowed him whole, and decided it had eaten enough. For the first time in 3 desperate months, Whitechapel drew a breath. But the police knew better. The silence was not peace. It was a held breath. And in that held breath, darker things stirred. The official story, the one fed to the newspapers and the terrified public, was that Jack the Ripper had killed exactly 5 women, the canonical 5. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Case closed in the minds of the press. The monster had come, fed, and gone. But the secret files told another tale. Scotland Yard's own Whitechapel murders dossier listed 11 killings between 1888 and 1891 that bore the same terrible signature. 11. The extra 6 were quietly sidelined, called copycats or ordinary East End slayings to prevent total panic. The phantom had not stopped on the 9th of November, 1888. He had simply learned to be quieter. The first of the hidden ones came 8 months later. The 17th of July, 1889, Alice Mackenzie. She was found in Castle Alley at 12:40 a.m. She was found lying on her back, much like the others. Her throat had been cut with a single, forceful stroke. The abdomen was opened, and the body showed signs of disturbance. Certain parts bore marks of mutilation that Dr. George Bagstow Phillips, the same surgeon who examined the canonical 5, insisted were made with the same blade. The injuries, he wrote, bear the same character as those of the previous murders. The newspapers barely noticed. The police called it a different hand. But the women of Whitechapel knew. They whispered his name again in the doss houses. The shadow had returned. Then came the 13th of February, 1891, Frances Coles. Swallow Gardens, another narrow, stinking passage behind the railway arches. Her throat had been cut so deeply that her head fell back unnaturally, like a broken doll. The brutality of the attack left no doubt it was the work of the same hand. A man named James Sadler was arrested almost immediately, a sailor with blood on his clothes and a history of violence toward women. But the evidence crumbled. He was released. And the mutilations, they were too precise, too familiar. The knife had moved with the same cold artistry. The police buried these cases. They told the public the Ripper was dead or gone. They had to. Another panic like 1888 would have torn the East End apart. But in the locked rooms at Scotland Yard, the files grew fatter. More names, more dates, more wounds that looked exactly like the ones from the Autumn of Terror. So why did the killing appear to stop? Theories, each one darker than the last, filled the silence like smoke. If the killer was Aaron Kosminski, the little Polish barber with the mad eyes, then the answer was simple and terrible. His own family had him committed to Coney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in 1891. The voices in his head grew louder. The knives were taken away. The phantom was locked behind iron doors and morphine, raving until he died in 1919. The murders ended because the man who committed them was no longer free to walk the alleys. If it was Montague John Drute, the gentleman barrister, then the Thames had claimed him on the 31st of December, 1888. His pockets weighted with stones, his mind crushed by guilt or madness or both. The phantom had simply walked into the black water and let the current carry his secret away. But there were other theories, ones that made the blood run colder because they suggested the monster had never truly left. The Royal Conspiracy. It began as a whisper in the 1970s and became a roar with Stephen Knight's book Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution. The story claimed that Prince Albert Victor, Prince Eddie, Queen Victoria's eldest grandson, the Duke of Clarence, had fathered an illegitimate child with a Catholic shop girl named Annie Crook. When the scandal threatened the monarchy, the Queen's physician, Sir William Gull, along with a coachman and a Freemason network, silenced the witnesses. The women of Whitechapel who knew too much were slaughtered in ritual fashion. Some theorists claimed the murders carried hidden meanings, that the victims were arranged according to secret symbols and patterns, hinting at connections to Masonic or occult geometry. Whether true or not, these ideas added another layer of mystery to the case. Prince Eddie himself, syphilitic, unstable, frequently absent from court, was said to have wielded the knife on at least one night. The cover-up was perfect. The police were ordered to look the other way. The murders stopped because the royal machine had finished its bloody work. Debunked. Yes, by historians, by DNA, by simple logic. But the fog loves a good conspiracy. Even today, on Ripper walks, guides still lower their voices when they speak of the royal carriage seen near Miller's Court on the night Mary Kelly died. The story refuses to die because it is perfect Gothic theatre. A prince, a doctor, the Queen herself, all drenched in East End blood. There were wilder whispers still. That the Ripper was a woman, a mad midwife named Jill the Ripper who used her medical bag to hide the knife and her knowledge of anatomy to carve with such precision. That he had fled to America and continued his work under new names. That the killings never stopped at all. They simply moved to other cities, other countries, wearing different masks. The killings appeared to end. But the phantom had simply learned patience. A letter arrived signed for the first time Jack the Ripper. Another boasted of the double murder before the papers even knew. Then came a small cardboard box addressed to George Lusk. Inside was a curious package preserved in wine. Alongside it was a chilling note that began, "From hell," and ended with the taunt, "It was very nice." The police could never prove which letters were truly his, but the words spread like poison. The phantom no longer needed a knife every night. He had discovered something far more powerful, fear that never dies. For 137 years the world hunted him through books, films, and midnight tours. Then, in 2025, a blood-stained shawl and new DNA tests almost ended the story forever. Headlines screamed that Aaron Kosminski was finally named. Scotland Yard said nothing. The case is still listed as open. Because on certain November nights, when the real fog rolls in thick from the Thames, you can stand in the old alleys and feel it. The cold breath on the back of your neck, the soft footstep that stops when yours stops, the faint scratch of a pen somewhere in the darkness. The phantom never left Whitechapel. He simply learned to wait, and to walk among us wearing new faces. And that was it, my friend. Hope you enjoyed. Tell me your ideas about all this in the comments, I would love to know. And if you have any story want to hear, just let me know. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Take care of you and hope to see you next time.